We have the first part of the particle systems in place, but let's continue so that we have something that, actually looks like dust. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create myself a material. It's going to be called m_dust. So I'm going to open up m_dust, and this is what we're greeted with. Now, when it comes to the material editor, this is our first time really kind of creating something, but I want you to keep in mind how everything is structured as we do it. The first thing is that I'm going to click here on the preview mesh to turn it into a plane, because any effect that we create is going to be spawned onto a single flat plane and shown within the world that way. With the plane created, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a particle color node. So this particle color node is what we use to drive effects from within the particle system. Whenever something sets the color, it's actually setting the color of it in this node. Whenever something sets the alpha layer, or the transparency, it's setting it within the alpha layer of this node. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to quickly just connect this to my base color, and I'm going to go to my required node and set this to be m_dust. Now, with that set up, I'm going to hit apply on my material, my m_dust. And in the world, you'll see that we have these white cubes, well, white squares floating around. Now, after I've done that, the next thing that's important for us to kind of look at and to work with is to get these looking like actual dust. Now, the best way that I can suggest doing that is to go back into the dust effect and start setting things up. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in the word radial. And there's a nice function called radial gradient exponential. And if I was to connect this and just plug that into my base color, you'll see that it's creating a nice radial fall off on this object. Now the reason that I want that is I kind of want to have a transparent sphere that is being used as the shape of the dust. So I'm going to go back ahead and plug this back into the base color. And this time around, I'm going to plug this into the opacity. However, there's a problem with that. You'll notice that upon connecting it, this is dark gray. And the reason for that is that by default, the material is told that it is opaque, which means that it has no transparent aspects. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to set the blend mode to be translucent. You can now see that we have a translucent radial fall off acting as our opacity. And the particle color is currently setting the base color. If I were to hit apply and go back to this, you can now see that these are circular shapes that almost look like snowflakes falling through the air. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and add some other little features to make sure this is correct. Now, let's go back to this dust mode for this first feature. Before I said that the colors are being driven out of this particle system. Now, how that works is if I go to color over life, I can see that there are two things that I can change: the color over life and the alpha over life. I'm going to open up the color over life, and the distribution, and then the curve, and then the points, and then each point. Now I know that's a long journey, but we got there. So within the constant curve, how this essentially works is that in member 0, it says an in value of 0, which means at 0% of your life, you are this color. In value of 1 means at the end of your life, you are this color. Now, purely for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to change this to say that at the beginning of your life, you are red. And I want you to look at the particles on my screen now. They start red, and eventually they fade into a white. Now, this is very, very important, because essentially it means that we can control how the dust looks in the world. I'm going to go return these to being a full white, because the thing that I actually care about here isn't the color. The thing that I care about is the alpha, because I want the dust slowly fading into existence and fading out of existence. To do that, I must go back to my material, and I must tell it to multiply. So I'm going to hold down M and left click to add a multiply. If you don't want to do that, you can always right click and type in the word multiply. And I'm going to multiply the alpha channel of the particle against the radial gradient exponential. And then I'm going to connect that to my opacity. What this means is that if a value was coming out of the radial exponential that was equal to 1, and it was multiplied against an alpha of 0, it would equal 0, and it would be invisible. If it came out and it was being multiplied against 1, it would be fully visible, and it would be fully visible here. So with that connected, I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to go back to my dust modes, and in the alpha over life, I'm going to open up these two areas. And you can see that by default, how alpha over life is structured is that at the beginning of your life, so at input 0, the output value is 1, so be fully visible. At the end of your life, so at input value 1, you need to be 0. And if I look at this in the world, you'll see that the particles are slowly fading out over time now, which is a nice start. However, it does have an issue that we want to address, and that is simply that we want them fading in as well as fading out. So I'm going to go back to my particle system. I'm going to click on this little arrow next to the 0, and I'm going to hit duplicate. And all I'm going to say is that for point 0, at 0% of your life, I want you to be 0. At 0.2 of your life, I want you to be 1. And then, at 1, I want you to be 0 again. Which means that it's going to fade in until it gets 0.2 of its life, at which point it's then going to fade out again. And if I look in the world, you can see that the particles that are spawning are kind of bleeping into existence and then bleeping out of existence. So, with that in, I'm going to hit save on my material, and I'm going to close this, and I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to start modifying some of the variables. It's a good idea to have your scene open as you do this. I'm going to start changing some of the things, such as the initial size, and I'm going to keep this open as I do so. Now in my initial size, at the moment it's between 1 and 10 centimeters. Let's try dropping that back to where we originally had it. I think that looks a bit nicer. There's a couple of motes here and there, but they're not too frequent. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the rate with which they spawn. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to set the spawn rate. So I'm going to click spawn, and I'm just going to drop that from 20 down to 10. This way we just get the occasional fleck of dust kind of appearing in our scene. Fantastic. Now the next thing for us to look at is to go ahead and actually kind of structure this a little bit nicer. And what I mean is we're going to go here and we're going to set these up to not go full bright. At the moment they're going between 0 and 1 when we light them up. But I really want this to be a very subtle effect. So I'm going to go to my dust modes, I'm going to go to my color over life, and under this value where I said at 0.2 be 1, I'm going to try setting it to be 0.5. Even that's probably still too bright. So I'm going to try decreasing it to 0.3. Now it's worth noting that every time I change a value, it's restarting the entire particle system. And one way I can get around that is by going back to my particle, and I'm clicking over here, just in this blank empty space. And under warm-up time, you'll see that it's set to 0. If I set it to 1, it means that every time it starts the particle effect, it starts it from 1 second in to where the things would have ended up, which is just a bit nicer for the refresh. So this is looking a bit better with them being kind of nice and subtle. But the final thing that I want to do is, as I get close to these, I really don't want to be able to run through them with the camera like that. So I'm going to structure them to automatically go invisible as we approach them. To do that is very, very simple. I'm going to open up my dust material, and not only am I going to multiply the alpha against the radial gradient, I'm also going to add something called a distance blend. So I'm going to right click and type in the word distance and blend. And you'll see that we have this value here called distance blend. All distance blend does, and I'm going to right click and preview it to demonstrate it, is that as I move towards the object, it goes from white to black. And it does so by being given a start offset value, which is the point where it changes, and the blend range, which is how long it's kind of gray for before it goes into being white or black. Now, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to plug in some values into here. By default, it's 100 and -1000. Now to plug in just a straight number into these things, all I need to do is add a constant. The alternative is I can hold down 1 on the keyboard and left click. Now the number I'm going to plug into my start offset is going to be equal to -100. And the number I plug into my blend range is going to be 200. This means for 200 units, it's going to go between its intended opacity and invisible. And at the 1 meter distance, it's no longer going to be visible. So again, I'm going to add a multiply. I hold down M to add those, or I can right click. The reason I use M is that it just is way quicker, and multiply is a very frequently used asset. I'm still previewing this. If I zoom in my particle, as they get closer, it vanishes. And this is what we want happening with ours as well. So I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to go into the world. And now when I get close to one, the little dust motes disappear. From here on in, it's a bit of a game of finding the right values. One thing that's happening is our anti-aliasing is kicking in when they get too small, and it's making them very hard to see. So to get around that, I can go into my material, and under the settings here, under translucency, there's an option that says responsive AA. This essentially says don't anti-alias this particle, so don't do any edge blending on the particle system itself. The final thing that I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to go back to here and I'm going to tweak this size until I get something that I'm comfortable with. Between 1 and 3 looks okay as a good starter point. It's just very subtle on screen. Now there are plenty of different things I can do with this particle system as well. I could make this way more interesting. I could make it automatically, have just a little bit of motion in it and dust going over the top. And in the example that I've provided, you can look at how I've done that. But for the time being, I think this is probably all I really want in this scene. So I'm going to hit play. You can see that just a couple of those little particles around the world kind of just add a little bit of character. I probably do want to turn down the number of them as well, though. Just a little bit of character. Fantastic. So with that done, let's go ahead and do the last thing that we want for this project, which is to make yourself a playable character that's not just a flying disembodied head. So to give myself actual controls that I can walk around within the world in, I've gone ahead and already created something. Don't worry, I'll show you how to make something similar to this in another lesson. For the time being, if you can drag an FPS character blueprint from the blueprints folder into the world, you'll see that we have this asset. It's got a nice little arrow that says which way we're currently facing. Now, if I add that to the world, and under here I type in the word possess, you can tell to auto-possess player 0. So I've changed it from disabled to say that the second the game loads up, let player 0 be this person. Now, my problem is that if I were to drop into the world and be this character, my sequence would automatically be playing over the top of it. So I'm going to go back to my sequence, and I'm going to just make sure that this loop is now set to don't loop. The other thing that I'm going to do is make a slight change to my sequence, because if I were to hit play, the sequence ends by telling the camera to fade to black. The problem is that we actually don't want it to fade to black. We want it to fade to black and then fade into our own view again. So I'm going to open up my sequence by going Cinematics, Sequence. And then all I'm going to do to set this up is I'm going to tell it that the world now goes for 23 seconds. I'm just going to stretch that out just a second. And all I'm going to do is this now goes to black here. And instead of setting a new camera at this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my fade track and I'm going to add an extra key whose sole job is to be set to 0. And now, if I were to hit play, it's going to play through my sequence. I'm going to fast forward this so you can see it. fades to black, and now it fades in, at which point I have nice control of my player that I can use W, A, S, and D controls on and move around. I'm now capable of kind of exploring my environment as a person would. I can look at my fancy paintings and doorways, and I can go through the environment in a realistic way. So that's it for our ArcViz demo. What I'd really like you to do now though is take what we've done and create a new room. I don't care how it's structured, but feel free to use any of the assets that we've provided and just create something new. It's really important you get used to just how to put meshes into a world and get it looking right, how to get lighting to come through and look nice, and how to get everything set up. So I'd highly, highly, highly recommend you kind of check everything out and just practice. So please do this just once more and then move on to the next lesson.